Hey, this is Hunter with Lone Star Woodworking, and in this video, I make myself some version of a pour table. I have to break apart the form on this kind of weirdly shaped piece of wood, and I work with probably the most rotted piece of wood ever. Alright guys, so for this build, we are using a species called silver poplar rootball. Now obviously silver poplar is in the poplar species, meaning it's really soft. But if you don't know what a root ball is, like I didn't leading up to this project, it is the mass that is formed at the bottom of a tree's root systems, and it's the result of the root system compacting the dirt around it into one solid mass. I've seen it a lot whenever I look at pictures from Galveston, whenever they're doing palm tree removal. There's always this ball of dirt and roots at the bottom, and that's the root ball. Now, whenever it came to building out the form, I don't know if it was laziness or just some weird form of ingenuity, but I had this 4x8 sheet of MDF just kind of laying around. I don't even know why I bought it, but it'd been there for a while. And I decided that I was going to put it on top of my workbench, level it out, and build myself a version of a pour table that you normally see built out of MDF. Or I'm sorry, not MDF, HDPE. There we go. And it worked remarkably well. So well, in fact, that I decided to incorporate this idea into my new workbench, at least the design for the workbench that I'm working on. And you've heard me talk about this new workbench, I think 3 times in the last 3 videos. And the reason that I keep mentioning it is because, one, I'm really excited. You know, it's always fun whenever you have to build yourself new shop furniture in order to accommodate your growth. Secondly, it's going to be not a normal workbench. It's going to be so multifunctional in order to justify the amount of space that it's going to take up, because it's going to be like 10 feet long and 4 or 5 feet wide. So I'm really excited for that aspect of it as well, and I just kind of want you guys to be excited along with me. Now for the epoxy in this table, they did not want the jet black that I normally do. They wanted some gray swirls, but with epoxy that you can still kind of see through. So what I'm doing with the mixing of epoxy at that point is getting that 2-inch deep cup and just kind of making sure that the look of the epoxy has exactly what I need. After that, it was as simple as pouring the epoxy, or so I thought. You can see here that I was way off by like 6 gallons, which is not a small amount. And I was pretty upset with myself because normally my calculations are pretty spot on. So had to wait a little bit. But the next day, this is what I came out to, and it was not a small leak. And so if you didn't know, if you're going to be doing some of these weird kind of live edge partial pours, just be aware that some of these cracks that reveal themselves on the end of the end grain might go all the way through the slab. All right, and because that extra batch of epoxy was going to take about a week and a half to get there, of course, the first pour cured, which means that I have to scuff it up in order to get that good mechanical bond with some 60 grit sandpaper. And if, in case you didn't know, the chemical bond is actually the best way to do this, where if you're going to have to do 2 pours, you wait about 24 to 36 hours for it to get nice and gummy and kind of tacky, and then you pour that second batch of epoxy on top of it, and then it chemically bonds versus this mechanical bond that I had to do where you scuff up the first pour. It works just fine. I'm not saying that if you have to mechanically bond the epoxy that it's going to come apart. It's just that that mechanical or that chemical bond is just a little bit more thorough. And in this shot, I was actually just talking to the clients, telling them like, yeah, I understand it doesn't look see-through right now, but once we get it off the table and some sunlight can get through it, you'll see that it actually is pretty translucent. And after about 2 weeks, it was time to bust this thing out of the form, or maybe just rip the form right off. By the way, shellac on MDF does not make for a good form side, but tape on MDF makes for just fine of a pour table. I was actually, again, very pleasantly surprised with how easy this was to bust off of this, and just kind of made me a little bit more excited for incorporating this idea into that workbench. And from there, I was going to get it off the workbench really quick to send a video to the client showing them how translucent it actually is. And am I using the word translucent incorrectly? Because it's kind of see-through, and to me that's translucent, but I feel like I'm using that word incorrectly. Anyway, after I sent this video to the clients, they were pretty happy with this. They thought that that was exactly what they were going for, and were happy to be moving on with the project. And from there, it was time to go ahead and get this thing flattened at Algoa Millworks. And I had a couple of other things that I was loading up here as well. Here you'll see in just a second, it's that sycamore crotch that I poured the activated charcoal in to see if it actually dried jet black. So I'm excited to get to work on that. Now, these slabs that I'm pulling out of the back of my truck are actually from a 300-year-old live oak that died of oak wilt. And I am very, very excited to have the opportunity to work with wood this old. I know that I've worked with that redwood before, and yes, that was also a very exciting thing for me, but you know, this oak is older than the US, which I think is just a really cool concept to think about. And that is for sale, not the slab itself, a table that I would make from it, but with one stipulation, that it has to remain live edge. I'm not going to be cutting any straight edges off that live edge. The only straight edges are going to be on either side, just because that's how the design works for those things. But it has to remain live edge. I want to keep that slab as natural as possible, just to kind of pay homage to the tree. All right, now it was time to address this huge area of rot on this silver poplar slab. And I sat here for probably 4 or 5 hours with some penetrating epoxy, and it took that long before it finally stopped absorbing anything. And it was kind of frustrating, kind of annoying to deal with, but this is going to be the top, so obviously it has to be extremely solid. After it had cured, I decided to go ahead and sand it off and get everything nice and even before moving on to a couple other design aspects like this. So they wanted this rounded radius at the end because they want some really heavy roundovers on the edges because they have grandchildren and they don't want anybody to smack their head on the side of this table and cut themselves open on a sharp edge, which I totally understand. So I talked them into this design aspect because I feel like this rounded radius at the end of the table just kind of fits with the overall rounded look that they were going for. Now you have to be super careful whenever you're cutting these things and how hard you're pushing on that jigsaw. I did an okay job. This edge definitely needs some TLC and some cleanup, but overall, you pretty much just have to let the jigsaw kind of carry itself through the wood. Don't try to force it because then you're going to get some really weird angled cuts. And then the last thing that I'm going to be taking care of as far as edge cleanup is this MDF edge. And they actually want this epoxy edge to kind of flow with the shape of the wood and have that more organic shape to it. But because once we cut that epoxy off, it's kind of gone, I decided I was going to go ahead and cut this edge straight, send them a picture, and give them the opportunity to be 100% certain that that is exactly what they wanted. And they overwhelmingly were in favor of going ahead and cutting the epoxy to that more organic shape. But before moving on to that, I decided to go ahead and do all these little epoxy touch-ups. And again, I had to dam off some of those end grain cracks, and which is another reason why I did that before I moved on to this part. And there were a couple of spots here where it just looks like some strands of rot just absorbed more, and so didn't quite get filled up to that nice and even part, so I had to sit there and fill them with some tabletop epoxy. And I don't know what it is about working with live edge wood, but for some reason there is always just that one void, that one crack, that one hole that just will not fill. And even after this had all cured, it still was not filled. So kind of frustrating, but it's just kind of part of it. And after those touch-ups had cured, I went ahead and flipped this thing over and started dealing with all of the rot on the back. And this took about as long as the top. It took about 4 or 5 hours of me just sitting here and basting it forever. It seemed like forever anyway, until this stuff finally stopped absorbing anything. All right, so while that penetrating epoxy is curing, I went ahead and started moving on to this idea for the legs that they had. And this is a table that they actually had that is being replaced by the table I'm building. And they wanted to see if we could keep the legs. Now, I don't know if these legs have any kind of sentimental value. or if it's because they were already there and they just didn't want to have to go buy extra legs. Not really my place to ask. But I said yes, I could go ahead and take them off of that table and see what we could do. And they're in kind of rough shape. I was asking them if they wanted me to kind of refurbish them or restore them, and they said, no, we don't want that. We just want to see if they're capable of being attached to the table. And the big problem that we ran into here is that these things are super short. They're like 23 inches tall, and a standard dining table or breakfast table is like 30 inches tall, which means that these legs need to be about 28 inches. And I told them that there was just no feasible way for me to design anything that would look good with the tabletop and actually accentuate the legs. So they said, okay, you know what, that's fine. We're going to have someone else build the legs. And I said, okay. Kind of stung because I have the ability to build legs. I have the ability to order legs. And to me, it just feels kind of incomplete without attaching them. But I was more than happy to just build the top. Now moving on to just kind of shaping this epoxy, because again, they wanted that more natural looking edge, even though this is an epoxy edge. So I just kind of outlined the shape of the wood and followed along with it. From there, it was the really simple process, but long process of sanding. I went ahead and took the bottom up to, I believe, 180. And after that, it was time to put these big roundovers on. And by the way, this router is freaking awesome. It's the new rigid router, or at least new to me. And it has a built-in dust collection system. And this is a 3/4 inch roundover. There should be dust all over my shop. But this thing actually has a pretty substantial vacuum system, and it doesn't let a ton of the dust get out. And if you can combine that somehow with an Oneida system, you'll have a dust-free routing experience every single time. From there, it was time to flip it over and get the top all the way up. I think I got it to 180, put my roundovers on using that same radius bit, and then took it up to, I think, 220 or 320. I believe it was 220. Now, whenever you have to sand kind of weird edges like this, and even big radiuses like I put on this table, I highly recommend you get yourself a soft pad, because that firm pad has a tendency to kind of dig in, and you might mess up the proportions of that radius throughout the table, if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense. Now, for some of these bigger voids on the end grain of the table, I went ahead and used some Thixo, Total Boat Thixo. Again, I used it in my last video, and it worked out really well. And then while that Thixo was curing, just kind of waiting to be sanded, I decided to clean up this one live edge and kind of round over all of these burl nubs. Because again, they really didn't want their grandchildren or even a guest just kind of scooting in close to the table and getting poked with that burl nub. After about a day, that Thixo was ready to be sanded and got everything up to 220. And now it's time for the best part, which is the finish. And this wood was hiding a beauty that I didn't know it was capable of. And as far as looks, this is probably my second favorite table. My first still has to be that Mappa. I think it's kind of hard to beat that. But this table looked absolutely gorgeous. And in case you were wondering, I am using Osmo for this, not Rubio Monaco. I actually ran out of Rubio, and for some reason, the delivery time was going to be unusually long, and the clients were really wanting this table done. So I knew that Osmo was a pretty good second to Rubio Monaco, so that's what I decided to use on this. And here you can see that, man, I am so surprised pleasantly by just how pretty this wood is. The streaks in there and even the rotted sections, I don't know, it just gives it some texture and it looks really freaking good. And guys, that is going to do it for the video. So if you've enjoyed what you watched throughout this entire experience, this is pretty much all I do, and I'm trying to expand to be a little bit more creative and have a little bit more diversity with my making. And if that's a journey that you want to be a part of, I would really appreciate a like and subscribe. All right, guys, so I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you next time. See ya.